It's recording. Wonderful. Good morning, everybody, and happy Monday. It's I believe, the last Monday in June. So we are getting ready for that second half of the year. I'm Cheryl Johnson Watts, and I'm the project director for the PACSP grant here at the Pennsylvania Coalition of Public Charter Schools. And we're very excited to continue our virtual summits. Today, we're going to talk specifically about academic intervention and dropout prevention. And we have someone who has made this his life work. And very excited about this opportunity for us to spend some time with him. I would like for each of us to introduce ourselves so that he has a feel for who is in the room. I know there's some other otters, and I'll tell him about that at another time, who those represent. But I'm going to move to Shantae Smith to introduce herself to Bill Milliken.
Good morning, Mr. Milliken. My name is Shantae Smith, and I am the manager of members and partner engagement for the Pennsylvania Coalition of Public Charter Schools. Cheryl Johnson Watts is one of my colleagues, and she works exceptionally well.
Oh, thank you. And Melanie Leo.
Hi, I am Melanie. I am the school counselor at Bear Creek Community Charter School, just outside of Wilkes-Barre in Pennsylvania. Going into my 10th year, which is weird to say out loud, but happy to be here today.
And Mandy Suro.
Hi, everyone. Mandy Suro, Community Relations and Development at Seven Generations Charter School. We're a K-8 building in Emmaus, Pennsylvania.
And Jesse Bean.
Good morning, everybody. Hi, Bill. Welcome. Jesse Bean, Charter Choices. We provide back office accounting and business services to about 60 charter schools in Pennsylvania. And I'm also the technical assistance lead on the PACSP grant. So thank you for joining our subgrantees in our community today.
And Madison Gould.
Hi there, my name is Madison. I'm the Director of Operations at Philadelphia Hebrew Public Charter School, which is a K-6 to be K-8 charter school in Philadelphia.
And we have the Meat Geek for Terrence Smith, who's the CEO of Midland Innovation and Technology Charter School, which is located in Beaver County, Pennsylvania. I am going to start with a very brief, and this is a brief bio of Bill Milliken. It does not capture all, but it most definitely will give you a feel for who you are listening to this morning. Bill Milliken, founder and vice chairman of Communities in Schools, Inc., is one of the nation's foremost pioneers in the movement to give young people the help they need to graduate from high school and go on to rewarding lives. Mr. Milliken's activism began in 1960 when he joined Young Life, an ecumenical youth organization. He helped initiate street academies for young people who had dropped out of school and wanted a chance to resume their education, as well as live-in programs for substance abusers and youth in need of shelter and support. His experiences led him to search for a comprehensive approach to helping young people. This search culminated in the 1970s with the development of a model program that repositioned existing community resources into schools. The Communities in Schools Network, which Mr. Milliken led as president until May of 2004. Thank you so much for joining us here today. And we've sent out a brief agenda to everyone, because we want to make sure that we get as much information as we can get into this hour. One of them is to start by you sharing with us your origin story. And I'm going to be quiet now because I can't wait to hear what you have to say.
Good morning. You missed the most important thing, and that I come from not only the greatest city in Pennsylvania, is where I was born, but in the country, following the greatest football team in the country, the Pittsburgh Steelers. So this morning, every morning I go out for a walk, I always have my Steeler cap on, and I get here in Washington area at least 3 or 4 shout outs. So I carry that banner. I'll be real, I'll give you a quick jet stream. I am not here as an authority on anything. God has a great sense of humor that I'm in education. I have eventually finished 3 freshman years of college. I was kicked out of school. I've written as many books as I've read, which is 4 of each, because they didn't know I had a learning issue back then where I grew up in Pittsburgh. And I did something really bad when I got embarrassed by a teacher. So I got into the dropout prevention world the day I got kicked out of school. And I got in with a really, really bad group because that was the only group that would accept me. A lot of them were undiagnosed too. I only had 5 of my friends make it to 30 without being in jail or prison. That isn't a group. If I would have been able to stay in school, I would have been in my middle-class neighborhood doing well. But a person from a group called Young Life came in a pool hall that I kind of chaired my daytime activities, and spent a year turning 5 of us around, and gave me hope. And that's why if you don't remember anything else, if you end up reading a book, you're going to be provided with the most important thing I learned in life. It's relationships that change people, not programs. There's no program that could have changed me or my friends. That it's all about relationships. It's hope in action, which is love. Going where people are, being in their face. As I gave a talk the other day, we don't need more Facebook. We need more people in young people's faces, eyeball to eyeball. And so I wouldn't be alive. I wouldn't be here if this volunteer happened to play for Pitt, for this Young Life organization. Just kept believing. Ultimately, he said, you have great organizational skills. You just need to do it differently. One of my friends that got help, instead of hurting other people, which I was part of, was putting a needle in his arm because he had given up. And he got turned around and had to serve some time. So this has had a very humble beginning out of Pittsburgh. He said he was going to kick drugs in jail and come out, and that we would give the rest of our lives back to the streets. So when he got out of jail, moved into Harlem because that's where he used to pick up drugs for selling them over in Patterson, New Jersey, which he had left to hide out in Pittsburgh. So that's just a quick. But the key element, and you'll see if you read the book, it took me 11 years in Harlem and the Lower East Side from 1960 to 71 to learn 5 things. I'm a slow learner, but I learned them well. One is it's relationships that change people, not programs. 2, every child needs and deserves not only a personal relationship with a caring adult, but a safe place to learn and grow. And that's what I learned when our minister in Harlem introduced me to the head of Trinity Parish in New York, because we couldn't say we love kids and let them live on rooftops. So Vinny, the minister, got us a meeting with the head of Trinity Parish, very wealthy church, and I talked him into giving me 2 tenements, one for young men and for young women. So from the time until I got married, my wife didn't want to live with 30 dropouts. in a tenement. She was very 5.5 years. I learned about how to build community. I lost a lot of kids. I spoke at 12 funerals by the time I was 25, and that's why I need a lot of therapy all the time, because it was very painful. But I learned, along with caring, you needed to have accountability. So I was learning as I went along. It's a relationship. The caring community has both caring and accountability. The third was Vinny came in and said, hey, how can we say we love kids? A lot of them are starting to make it now that we got it right where we're living, but they can't get back in school. I didn't have any credentials. I was pretty angry because I couldn't understand. I was speaking at kids' funerals 30 blocks away from the richest people I'd ever seen. And I just didn't understand. It was the first time I began to see from the streets up in my 20s just the inequities of the world. I learned I could speak. I couldn't write speeches, but I could give them. And so I wasn't welcome in the schools because I thought they were destroying kids. They were the one, and they wouldn't take our kids back in. So back then, a GED was worth gold, and there were a lot of these smart young people from Columbia, New York University, Princeton, etc. I said, I know how to turn kids on to living. I need you to turn them on to learning. Instead of just marching, I need you to. So we started our own schools. Later, Joel Klein, who was a friend of mine that ended up years later as the head of the chancellor of the New York City school system, said, yeah, these were really the first charters, because what we did, if you remember Bill Bradley, who's still around, he was my captain at Princeton, and I had others. They all became our teachers. And I found out, I made the mistake of calling them liberation schools. I didn't know that was bad for fundraising. So over some beers with some Columbia students, they said, maybe if we changed the name, we'd get some money. So I said, what do rich people call their schools? And they said academies. So you'll read about the street academies we created. It was all about timing. We had one that was working when the riots hit. My African-American minister in Harlem said, Wall Street's all upset. They're afraid everything's going to burn down. I told them about the street academies. Would you go down? So I had to make peace with that street called Wall Street. And they wanted to get involved and pay for our infrastructure. And I said, I need to have you be part of it. So I got them to name it Union Carbide Academy, and we built a bridge from our street to their street. So we had an IBM school, AT&T, American Airlines, Union Carbide. They all supported one of these congressmen back there. Charlie Rangel was a friend, and he said, you know, we have no high school in Harlem, which blew me away. And he said a lot of these students could go on to college. So we created Harlem Prep School, and the rest is history. It just kind of grew from there all across the country. Every time there was a riot, I got invited. It's not a good way to replicate, but that's how we spread it. You'll read about it if you do. But at the end of the 60s, I was asked, they had a thing called the Kerner Commission that was studying the riots. And somehow they found out about me, and they said they couldn't figure out how a white guy with long hair that had no degrees could be invited to speak before this group. But they were looking for somebody that was white and who'd been in a riot to testify. I think that was my only credentials. It was then that laid the base that became communities and schools. I had no intentions of leaving the streets. But at that commission, they said, what's going to be the next big issue? And I said, we're going to win or lose the future of America at the schoolhouse door. And you're going to think it's an education issue. And I said, I'm self-taught, and I traced back, and everything what you're doing today, I discovered back then. was going to happen. I said, you have to look at the education issue, and the fact that we're losing 1 million kids a year affects everybody. It's going to be the biggest civil rights, economic, and moral issue of our time. And I said that you can't look at it through the lens of education, but through the lens of poverty, which they didn't. They looked all about how can we improve the schools without understanding the role of poverty. I said, what happened between right after World War II into the 60s, we slowly pulled apart the safety net for children, which was the extended family and relationship with the faith community were the mediating structures. So later Hillary writes a book, It Takes a Village to Raise a Child, out of the African proverb. I said, Hillary, there's no village. We lost the village over a long period of time. Right after World War II, when the farmers, instead of going to the farms, went into the cities, you had the migration from Alabama, Mississippi, and written up in Man, Child in the Promised Land. Anyhow, I said back then, and it unfortunately happened, I said schools fell into the vacuum that was created by that breakdown of community. And I got less angry at the schools when I started meeting with teachers and seeing the kids and what was going on. More and more, they were being asked to be mother, father, sister, brother, social worker, hall guard, everything but teachers. And I said, they're going to get blamed for this. And I began to get a real appreciation of what was happening inside the schools, and that how unnatural it was that schools became the hub. But I said, in our lifetime, it's going to be the hub, and we're going to win or lose the future of America on whether we turn the faucet of the schools off, because people are not going to want, like my neighborhood, where over 30% of the kids were on the streets. You don't want to put a gas station or a grocery store or anything like this. Fortunately for me, a mayor that I'd helped in Indianapolis in 68, 69, with a race riot, came and saw what we were doing in Harlem. And he was the mayor that was representative on those hearings. And he asked me, he said, what you did in the 60s with these storefront schools all over the country isn't sustainable. And also you're getting them after they already dropped out of school. Can you do a heart transplant and put them inside the schools to keep kids from dropping out in the first place? Because if you don't turn off the faucet of the schools, you're going to constantly be bailing out the basement of the community. So he took me to a large foundation, and it's the only time in the history that they gave money for something that hadn't happened, but did it bad and gave the money for us to take what we were doing on the streets and put it inside the schools. And I'll take about 2 more minutes on this and then open it up. But our insight was, how do we help the schools to free up the teachers to teach and the principal to be a principal? And by the way, this prediction ultimately led to what the community school movement many years later, because they began to see that the school is the hub, and any ultimate change you make, you've got to start with the school and work out. So we did a heart transplant. I moved to Atlanta. We had about 300 young people down where, and we moved into the neighborhood, 2 families, 17 of us, to give our lives to that community and do the first heart transplant. I was fortunate Dr. Benjamin Mays was still alive, and the first African-American superintendent of a major southern city, Dr. Alonzo Krim, was there. Annie Young was over our neighborhood. So we were part of that civil rights thing in the 60s. John Lewis later said to me, stay in your lane, keep those kids in school, because emancipation without an education doesn't get us anywhere. So we were a natural for them to back us, and it was the right place to plant in the schools. What's different, the reason we started with 120 young people, One of them's in the first chapter of my book, Reginald Beatty, who's still one of my best friends, and we do work together. That we introduced a new idea, and that was to put what we call a site coordinator. I told the head of Cisco Systems in the early 90s when he asked what made us different, I said our router, and he was ready to throw me out of the room because he said, we have the router. I said, yes, you've changed how we collect, organize it, information, but we have a relational router because we need a person integrating all the services these kids need because they need a PhD in systems because we siloed all these things that kids need. And I said, you do the same thing government does, that you criticize. You waste money because you fund the Boys and Girls Clubs in one part of town, the health people in another, the faith people in another, the criminal justice. The kid needs a PhD in systems to get help. So we have a daughter that's a nurse, and I like to use the illustration that our site coordinator is just like a triage nurse at the door, the community organizer who knows which kids are coming to school and need food, clothing, shelter, or what have you, and which kids are gang banging, drugs, and suicide attempts, or mental health. So we call it, use the fancy word case management. That person knows what that kid needs, are the eyes and ears of the community, the relationship with the parents. Therefore, the teachers started loving us because now they can be teachers instead of social workers and everything else. And the principal loved us because he could, or she could be the manager of the place. And so it took lots of failures, lots of ups and downs, but we outlasted. Again, we were living in a poor neighborhood, 17 of us, and I said I moved into an intentional community so that I could meet a governor who was going to become president of the United States. Anyhow, he came and saw when he was governor, Jimmy Carter, what we were doing. So when he became president, I commuted for 4 years and he helped me build the infrastructure so that we could get it. Now we're in 3,300 schools, and we just passed this year, we'll have 2 million kids a year. And it's an overnight success. It's only taken 45 years. I still haven't gotten a job. That's going to be my next book, How to Get to 84 Without Ever Having a Job. All I've ever done was hang out, but I hung out from the streets of Harlem to the streets of Wall Street to the streets of this crazy town, at the White House and the streets of Beverly Hills, because I've been able to get a lot of help from the music industry because they understand integrated systems. So that's my 10 minutes. That's more than you may need. But if you don't understand context, then it's a waste of your time listening to me, because everything else you can read of the how-tos. But it's a movement that successfully became an organization that now has a presence out there.
This is awesome. We are going to use this this pause to take questions, and there were a couple of other segments that we had. We want to give as much time as possible for the questions. So if you could raise your hand or just unmute and ask your question. Okay, I do not see any raised hands. So then we'll move forward to the, I'm sorry, was there a hand?
Sure, I was going to ask the question.
Sure.
Hey, Terrence.
Yes. How did you see when you came in and understood that that the kids and their families needed more than what was in a school? How did you see any support coming from the school once you saw that the social and emotional things that these students and these parents needed? Did you see any support coming from the school systems?
Yeah, I mean, the greatest support is seeing them do what they're being asked to do. I said, we create the new wineskin so that whatever you pour in there, and then we help them find. I work on a lot now that I'm freed up to do this from the board position. They decided to keep me on as Colonel Sanders to run around getting these things happen. I'm looking for the best content or the best wine to put in the wineskin. And so like right now I'm working with a thing called musology out of Nashville, which is one of the biggest breakthroughs I've ever seen in bringing math scores up for kids who have been turned off by using math and math as music. So we've been able to get people like Usher and others to do math to music. So I'll try to find that, help them grow, and then introduce them to school systems so that they can have the content to pour in to the safe environment we do it. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes.
But we can't do, there's no magic in this. If you don't have a good principal, you can have the best site coordinator in the world. A lot of kids will get food, clothing, shelter, and need, but they aren't going to excel when you have a good principal and a good site coordinator. We have the data. We have 11 independent evaluations. We've had 2 major investments in the last 4 years to help us go into another 1,000 schools in the next. We're on a real acceleration around the country. We finally learned how to deal with Appalachia. I'm a guy from Pittsburgh. I didn't even know what that was. Except if I wanted moonshine, I'd go to West Virginia.
Thanks. Yeah, that makes sense.
And I want
Where are you, Terrence? I didn't hear. Where are you from?
We're about 40 miles north of Pittsburgh.
Praise be.
Yeah.
That's where you missed it. That's where I'm from.
Oh, okay. Okay. What part?
Wilkinsburg.
Oh.
Yeah, they tore my high school down.
Yeah. I worked there. For 4 years.
Well, I'm glad I got out before I was a problem for you. Well, I'm glad to meet you. Steal it.
Same here. Same here.
I'm glad you made that connection, because I was just getting ready to point that out, that he is the CEO of Midland Innovation and Technology Charter School. And that is right there just outside of the Pittsburgh area.
Yeah.
So we're really glad that that you're able to be on the call. So just I didn't see any other hands, but please just unmute, because we're at that place where, you know, it's like ask questions at any time. So can you tell us a little bit more about that first generation of communities and schools, and what were some of the things that you realized over time that tended to be a trend that had to be resolved? And, you know, because everything's kind of like a evolutionary process. And so what were some of the trends that you saw over time with those that first 10 or 20 years of communities and schools?
The first 10 to 20 years, I was just trying to meet payroll. I mean, you build something off the streets and you don't have credentials. If you think it's hard to start when you have all your PhDs and everything, man, they knew we loved kids, but we were a threat to them. We had to learn their language. We had to appreciate. So I spent a year just riding school buses, sitting in cafeterias, getting over my bias, thinking it was their fault. And then when I got to understand that all these do-gooders wanted to come in and change them, I don't like people coming in trying to change me. So I sit there, man, people coming in criticizing us. I'm trying to stay alive. I'm trying to meet these kids' needs. So the first was just getting them to believe we were there as friends, not to change them, that we were there as partners to change things together and to hear one another and to hear. So I had to learn to listen more than I had learned as a wild man. I had to be humbled and just, the hardest lessons was being able to sit and listen and learn what you don't know. Because everything to me is context. You can come up with the greatest thing in the world and have the greatest solution for the moment, but if you don't understand how you got into place in the first place, that's why I traced it back to right after World War II. It was nobody's fault. that there was this farmers going into the cities, the Industrial Revolution and the migration from the south to the north, looking for the promised land that wasn't there in the Industrial Revolution. It was just, you just had to see that that's what happened. And you get out of the blame game and you get in and say, okay, how do we solve this? I don't know if that answers it or not, but by the way, one of the great things is our first national training center was at Lehigh University. And I would always start off the training. It was at the Iacocca Institute. And I'd say, at the end of the week, you'll be a great site coordinator, a CIS director, if you can do two things, whitewater rafting and weaving. And they would laugh that at the end of the week, they got it. That you're trying to take a very fragmented, siloed world, which unfortunately our funding streams are in these silos, both public and private, to break those silos down and to create integrated systems. And you're living in an arc, by the way, that some of us have spent our whole life on, which is exciting. That's why, by the way, the thing I didn't mention, I'm the only one left alive, but 5 of us in a storefront in Harlem in 1970, before I went to Atlanta, wrote a 100-year plan. And people said, why did you write a 100-year plan? I said, because the theory of change in America sucks. Is not good. And so they said, what do you mean? They said, tell me any time in history, any meaningful changes happen in 2 to 4 years or 3 to 4 years. And at this hearing, they said, well, it's never happened. I said, then why do you in government give us 2 to 4 years to bring change, and then you keep changing the name of the same things you do over and over again? I was real popular at these hearings. And foundations tell us we have to bring the change in 3 years. So we had to have the core at this movement, people who were going to give their whole lives to it, because we had to outlast superintendents, mayors, governors, and finally getting a bipartisan at the national level behind it. So we could give you weeks of teaching on how not to do things. But by learning how not to do it, we are obviously successfully doing it now. And I didn't understand that along with passion, you had to have professionalism and data. So fortunately, I had a genius come in to take my place. It was our field operations when I stepped aside, and we're still best friends. But he was a settler who knew data and knew that we had to have data to back what we're doing. And these 2 large investments we got, we didn't even ask for the money. They found us because they said, nobody's been more evaluated than you in the country. We have 11 independent evaluations and a return on investment. So I've lived long enough, and I'm glad they still keep me around, that I've been able to see and carry on what I made a commitment to my brothers and sisters that I'd never give up. And so I have the fun of doing what I'm doing today.
That's awesome. As a matter of fact, tomorrow we have a session on the use of data for instructional leadership. So it's a great thing to hear that data has been and has continued to prove itself to be of value in this process, that sometimes, you know, when it's hard to quantify some things related to social matters, at the end of the day, it's amazing to hear. And who helped that process of defining how to go about that? How did you navigate that?
Navigate which?
Bringing data into the conversation. How did that come about?
Well, I was the biggest problem because, to be very honest, in the early people that were doing some evaluations from the government, there was so much racism. They were outsiders coming into the community, and they didn't even know how to ask the right questions. They were asking from a lot. So I was very prejudiced toward evaluations as just a way to get rid of us meddlers. But then in our 100-year plan, the goal was to get big enough to where we could affect policy. And I'm really glad you brought this up, because it's another thing I've gotten to see before I leave this earth. In the recent, we got language that is the reason we're growing, one of the reasons we're growing so fast in the federal. Because I said, if we don't affect policy, we're going to never reach the 100-year goal that all children have a chance, that it isn't just us. So we were growing tremendously during the Clinton years. And then I said, okay, we're big enough. How do we affect policy? Well, they said you got to have a cumulative data in order to have a longitudinal study so that you can affect policy. Well, street guy, I said, man, those are big words, so they're going to cost a hell of a lot of money. In fact, the first was more money than my entire budget, because when your whole life is this, I took a year. That's when in the early 90s, I got to the head of Cisco Systems, and he asked me what made us different, why they should invest in us and pay for this. I said, because we're in the same business. We're in the router business. And you're changing how we collect, organize, and disseminate information. We have a relational router that's integrating all these things you're giving money to. And it's also, by the way, your future workforce, and was able to show them that in 17 years, I had the data that you will be in trouble work-wise, because we're dealing with your future employees. And if they're out of school and dropping out, you don't have employees. I said, this is a business deal. It's not a charity deal. So it's changing the mindset of getting out of the charity mindset into the change mindset. And I got that money. And then later, somebody came up miraculously. I didn't even ask for it, for the money for the longitudinal. And we had the first scientific, a 5 million 5-year evaluation. It scientifically proven that we were the only program in the country that dealt with dropouts, that not only kept them in school, but graduated them on time and had in the 90s attendance with the hardest score. My theory of change was, and I do want to get this in, and you're right there in the middle of it. It took all these years. I had a chance. I'm Forrest Gump too. I get invited to frickin' things that other people don't. They don't know how I get in the room. But way back, I said, when Children at Risk came out, and they were going to change federal policy on all this. I said, if you enact this, you're spreading your money, and it's going to fail because you aren't looking at it through the eyes of poverty. I said, it's the bottom third that's the anchor that's pulling down public education in America, and I'm going to stick to it till you either get rid of me or I kick the bucket. And so it's taken all these years for them to understand that the non-cognitive of kids coming to school. I mean, you have to pay money to get this evaluated, that if a kid comes to school hungry, he's not going to do as good as the person that has a full stomach. If a kid's coming to school where his mother was taken to jail last night, they're going to have a little bit trouble, or if they are living on a rooftop. You pay all this money to prove that it's love, it's the transformational thing, and all you want for these kids is what you're doing for your own kids, that it's an equity issue. So how do you create that resources? And so it was that you can now, we were able, it took 7 years of working with the head of the education committee, but in the Every Child Success Act, you can now pay for our site coordinators out of Title I. So what we do with superintendents and principals, and we come in and say, we've got investors like Balmer and McKinsey and them, they'll put up half the money, you put up half the money to make it a public-private partnership. And they love that because it stretches, but you have to ultimately see that site coordinator is just as important is your principal. And the cities we've been in over the long run will not even hire a principal without hiring the right site coordinators. One's internal, one's external. So we've affected policy that whether you're called communities and schools or not, or community school, whatever you're calling it. So our theory was, if you look at our North Star, I won't be here. Our 50-year mark is coming up. They told me I had to stay alive 3 more years, so I can celebrate our 50th. But the 100-year goal was to have a site coordinator in all 72,300 Title I schools in the country, because my theory of change was release that anchor that pulls down the rest of education resources. You're going to be able to have the resources to affect the rest of it. And it's only taken 44 years for people to begin to listen to that on the Hill and in the capitals, et cetera. It's nice to be at this place because we only go by invitation now. We don't ask for anything. We went from pushing for 40 years to being pulled in because they understand that, and we're in such an incredible crisis. And I want to take time to thank you all for being in the trenches and being out there every day. And you know what I'm talking about. I don't mince words, whether it's on the Hill or on the streets, because I think truth frees us, and love is our motivation. It keeps us going, but we need each other. That we need community just as much as those kids need it. If we aren't healthy, if we aren't taking care of ourselves, you can't give away what you don't have. And I got burned out 2 or 3 times on the streets. I had to learn the hard way. And so I really thank you for what you're doing, because you're out there in the trenches, and we need everybody in those schools that are doing this.
It's awesome. I'm sharing in the chat the mission statement of Communities in Schools, and it is, at Communities in Schools, we surround students with a community of support, empowering them to stay in school and achieve in life. And I will tell you that that mission statement, I don't know how many meetings you all must have had to be able to finesse bringing it down to this one simple sentence, because it encompasses so much. I just want to share with everyone how I first learned of Communities in Schools. I was running for school board in Allentown, eventually became a school board member for the Allentown School District. At that time, it was about 17,500 students. And Allentown has a number of issues related to poverty, has a number of issues related to graduation rates. And I saw a video with Tim Milliken of Communities in Schools. And I said, I've got to find this man, and I got to find out what this program is all about. And in that process, I had an opportunity to meet site coordinators from different schools. One of them, I think, was Jackson Elementary. Another one was Roosevelt Elementary, and South Mountain Middle School. And basically, from speaking with those site coordinators, I started to get a real-time sense of what was happening. First of all, because to get to meet with them was a process. And then as I sat with them, different things were happening, and I got to see them in action. And ultimately, the whole concept, when I circled back to Tim and I said, I'm looking for someone to speak about academic intervention and dropout prevention. And he said, well, why don't you talk to Bill Milliken? And I was like, wait a minute, he's actually like available to talk about this. And he's like, yeah, I'll set it up. And you know, through those experiences, hearing your story of where you were in life and how you determined this isn't going to happen to everybody. Like, you took on a task that I don't even know if you even concerned yourself with how huge it seemed to, you know what I mean? Like, whether you were in any way daunted by the task, but you forged through. And one of the things that I feel is so important in this conversation is for people to hear about that forging into the unknown, because I don't know if you realized you would be where you are right now when you decided to take on those buildings. Even before you took on those buildings, just the fact that you said, I'm going to get involved with education, and I'm going to find a way that this, what I've experienced, doesn't happen to everyone.
You hit it right on the head. And by the way, one of the fun things in recent years, it wasn't in the early days, but we're in more and more charter schools all over the country. I was amazed at how many we've been invited into, because frankly, we're about the kids. If that's where they want it, we're everywhere. I get caught sometimes between in some of these cities like Newark. We're going in a big way. There's such a division. Cory Booker's a good friend, and I knew him when he was a kid, a young person, and he said it's the biggest problem in dealing with our 72,000 kids is it's so divided, the charter schools and the others, even the public charters, and we're in there trying to bring reconciliation and take all 72,000 kids on as a big education ecosystem so that every kid from elementary, middle, high school, wherever they're at a charter or a Catholic school, whatever they are, stay centered on the kid and have us come together around that and share our best practices. So that's why it was fun to be invited to be on here, because we're all in this together.
And Lincoln Leadership Academy is one of our beloved charter schools here in the Lehigh Valley. And I believe you recently started there a year or two ago or something. I'm not sure of the timeline, but Tim had mentioned that to me. We are at 11:52, and I want to make sure that, even though I'm trying not to allow for silence in the schedule, I do want to make sure that I haven't overlooked anyone with any questions, because it is quite an opportunity to have to be able to hear firsthand your experience.
Well, while we're waiting, you said you're going to give them books. If any of you ever have questions or you're ever here in Waco, Washington, come on by. I call Washington 60 square miles surrounded by reality, but you have to be here to fight the battle. Also, when I spoke up in Hershey, when Tim asked me at our state gathering, I hadn't been to Hershey. That was my reward, was to stay at that hotel if I spoke. But instead of giving me a T-shirt for the speech, I got a 5-pound Hershey bar that I'm still, if you ever come, I'll just give you a piece. That's my weightlifting in the morning. I use my 5-pound Hershey bar.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, I did not see any other hands raised, and I'm just going to ask one last question to round things out, and that is the world so different today than it was when you were 15? And if there's one thing that you see consistent that that you would want all of us to be mindful of as we go through each day interacting with students from a variety of circumstances.
How long do we have? No. At 15, you wouldn't want to know me. At 17, I had given up on life and had thumbed all over the country looking for it. And I had no hope. And then when I got kicked out of school, it was all over. So I started at a very dark place. The next darkest place was in 68. I didn't think I'd get off the streets alive as a white person in the middle of all the turmoil of the assassination of 3 of our great leaders, all causing great stress on the streets. I thought it couldn't get any worse. And I honestly, I'm not being over dramatic. If you told me I would have gotten out of that, there was many times in those up to that point were hairy, but it was all over and we were under attack. If you'd have told me we would have a heart transplant of what we had been doing faithfully on the streets, I'd say you're crazy. We're going through what I would call a more dangerous time. It was dangerous in a different sense back then, but we weren't facing what we're facing now, with a whole breakdown of not just some people upset and some riots and stuff. I never felt like the very fabric was going to just blow apart. And that's why I've learned, it took me a long time, a lot of therapy. I got, somebody said, what are your degrees? And my graduate are ADD, ADHD, and PTSD. And I said, I didn't have to go through all those, but fortunately, I married a saint that saved my life and got me into help. And I think we're going to be in for some really more difficult times. And I just stress, and I was so proud of they had 100 of our team down in Richmond from around last week, and I spent half the week on mental health issues of the staff. If you've got to take care of yourselves and you've got to have community, everything we ask for the kids, we got to have. We need that trusted personal relationship with somebody that gives a damn we exist and is willing to walk with us through anything. We need community in order to give away community. So I wanted to take these couple minutes just to say, take care of yourself, take care of your families, but stay in the light and be around, because all you hear is the negative stuff. There are so many unbelievable, and I'll end with this. I spent 2 days, well, actually a day there, another day, my first trip to Uvalde since we were called in there. And we were the first called in after the shootings there. It was one of the most painful days, half days. The first day was painful, half a day. Just seeing the stuff on the frickin' walls of kids that had died and quotes from their parents, and just but then I went inside those schools where we had 5 of our staff from around Texas moved their families, gave up their positions where they were, and are committing their lives to Uvalde, moved their families there because they knew they had to be with them. And they're getting a lot of help. It's we didn't have time to set up a separate, so it's being run out of San Antonio. So we have lunch with the superintendent, and she gave up retiring from another place and told her husband, we can't walk away from this. And you get in there and see these site coordinators, and you see these teachers, and these kids gave me a little book of thank you notes of how powerful love is. And you got to keep in that light and surround them with hope. And hope is strictly love and action. And you are that hope there. And if you're hurting and you are getting help, then you are going to be able to be there for the long term. And that's what these kids don't need people there. Sometimes they need them. They're just like your kids need them. The kids that don't have what you have need them too. So anyhow, this is fun. I wish you were here in person and I could share the Hershey bar, but I'll have to eat it for you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. And if we can just give a shout out to Bill Milliken as we depart, you can unmute and just say goodbye or thank you or whatever you'd like to do. just so that we could make it more of a in-person connection, even though we're virtual. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you.
Blessings.
Thank you.
Awesome. Take care.